Okay, I hope everybody is well fed, but will stay awake. And I guarantee you, in terms of the production that will come from this panel, it would hopefully keep you awake. But we're waiting for the sugar rush to hit in, maybe about another couple of minutes or so. So that's why we made sure you had dessert. Thank you for coming back to the afternoon session. I think it's this panel follows very well from the discussion that we had earlier. The topic of Katrina is one of familiarity to most of us, but unfortunately we so desperately need the lens of critical race studies to really understand how not to have this happen again. Issues of identity, culture, environmental spaces, and the law are essential dialogues to ensure, because one of the things that we can guarantee is that there will be another hurricane. But what we do want to make sure does not happen again is the response. And therefore, the lens that is needed to apply has yet to have enough discussion. And today's panel is one in which I think we all hope that we can begin to talk about how critical race studies can help us to enact policies, laws, and to have a perspective to hopefully bring what we saw as such tragedy to an end. The way we'll do this today is I'm going to introduce the three panelists now. You have a very long introduction to each, so I'm going to try and highlight their work that's relevant to today's panel. Each will speak for approximately 15 minutes. I'm even making it public here. See what we can do. And then we will follow it with questions and answers. Our first panelist that will present today is Dr. David Trout, who is a professor of law and the Justice John J. Francis Scholar. He writes in two primary areas. One is about metropolitan equity and race, as well as about intellectual property and culture, often combining law and other areas, other disciplines in particular, together, which makes him an excellent contributor to begin to talk about critical race studies. His law scholarship includes such pieces as, and I love this title, A Portrait of the Trademark as a Black Man, Intellectual Property, Co-Modification, and Redescription. Professor Trout is also the author of or editor of several books, such as The Monkey Suit and other short fiction on African Americans and justice. And the one of interest today is After the Storm, Black Intellectuals Explore the Meaning of Hurricane Katrina. We welcome you today. Thank you very much for being here. Our second presenter will be Professor Oscar Gandy, who is an emeritus professor for the University of Pennsylvania, where he was in communication studies and is currently now out here on the West Coast. Professor Gandy is one of those professors whose legacy lives in terms of how his work has influenced many scholars in different fields. His scholarship is in the area of media, race, and communications. Similar to Professor Trout, Professor Gandy has also authored a number of books and articles, and in particular of interest today, one of the titles is Communication and Race, A Structured Perspective. We welcome you here. My colleague, Professor Cheryl Harris, is also known for her pioneering work in the area of critical race studies, her work in employment discrimination and constitutional law. And in terms of this particular panel, her convening, the law school had a forum back in November 2005 under the theme, From the Gulf Coast to the West Coast, a cross-regional consultation, of which I was privileged to be able to participate. She and Devin have also published an essay in Professor Trout's book entitled Whitewashing Race, Scapegoating Culture. So without further ado, why don't we get started today with Professor Trout.
I just want to start out by saying that despite my limitation in time, which I also think is just deeply unfair and want everybody to admit, that I would be remiss if I didn't tell you just what a profound pleasure it is to be back in California. Sort of an adopted home for me as a New York son. I spent 8 years in California. I really in many respects, got my political bearings here and may even have become a man, both in college and then coming down, working in Oakland, and eventually spending a year working in Los Angeles, which I discovered, much to my New York chagrin, is a real city where people live real lives and struggle in deep and very meaningful ways. So I feel like I put on my political weight here. It may not look like it, but you should have seen me then. And so it's very meaningful to be back. I'm really quite grateful to be here with you today, and I'm also grateful to the organizers because I think the topics that are being covered during this conference are extraordinarily important. Let me try to do a couple of things. I do want to give some insights into the genesis of the After the Storm book, and then I had planned to give you my conclusions up front in the event that I'm told I'd run out of time, and I want to make sure to at least put them out there. And then I was going to try to just do two other things briefly, and one is to talk about one of the first discoveries I made in this journey of discovery around Katrina, and then to talk about the other, which has emerged more recently in my ongoing research on New Orleans and on urbanism. There are many stories that one can tell about Katrina, about New Orleans, about disaster, about cities and marginalization, etc. I am an urbanist focusing on economic marginalization, so I sort of came naturally to the Katrina issue. But I shared a horror with a lot of people and also a real interest in seeing that promised discourse on the intersection of race and class that Katrina supposedly brought up for so many Americans, and was even for a while trumpeted by our president, who unfortunately forgot that trumpeting as recently as his last State of the Union address, when he omitted any reference to New Orleans and the recovery effort. I happened to be at the Lat Crit conference in Puerto Rico. Oh no, it wasn't because it was in Puerto Rico that I was at the Lat Crit conference. And it was one of those stunning nights where you've listened to a lot of people who are a lot smarter than you and had a lot more to drink than you should have had at that time. And I had just finished a conversation with Daria, and I was thinking, boy, she really is so smart. And then I had gone back, had another couple of conversations. Had another couple of conversations, and then experienced this sort of epiphany of horror that with all the rage that we experienced around the Katrina issues, it was critically important that we as scholars contribute to that discourse. There were a number of questions that public intellectuals could at least begin to answer, and that it seemed that time was of the essence. And so I dashed from my room, I guess it was almost 3 in the morning, and found Devin Carbato still standing. What happens in Puerto Rico stays in Puerto Rico. Except that he was the first person I broached the idea of the book to, and he said, "Yeah, I'd be interested," and that really sort of set it off. And in the ensuing months, it was a question of collecting scholars who could write under an unbelievable time pressure. We got the book out in about 9 months in time for the anniversary. We've done a fair amount of radio and other publicity trying to engender that national discourse. And I just also want to take this opportunity to say that it has been such a privilege to do some of those talks with Professor Harris, because Cheryl's comments have just been some of the most stunning comments. And as you listen to audiences react in call-in shows, it's really profound how she has taken up that intellectual challenge that really began with black studies to act as a critic and a lover of America, as well as the critical race scholars' obligations to critique a country that they care about, and to try as best they can through that critique to suggest some real means toward transformation. So that's the book, and it covers a lot of different stories. As I mentioned, mine has continued to be a journey of discovery, and I'm still struggling with meanings. Let me give you some of the basic observations and the basic conclusions that, I think have occurred to many of us, but particularly from my urbanist perspective. We saw in New Orleans tragic evidence of segregation and its lethal effects. Its lethal effects, which is not something that we talk about that often, that even I as an urbanist don't talk so much about segregation. New Orleans reminds us of the centrality of segregation, and as we watch those bodies rotting in their streets, of the lethal effects of that degree of marginalization. We saw a city overwhelmed by the magnitude of its structural burdens before the storm. We talk a lot about how it's been overwhelmed after the storm. It was clearly overwhelmed before the storm. We saw an extreme version of the problems of large cities and concentrated poverty. And in this respect, I want to note that New Orleans is a special place. I've come to fall in love with it. But it is not an exceptional place. In fact, most of what we've seen in New Orleans in terms of class and racial divisions is very commonplace. And so we saw an extreme version of those problems associated with large cities and concentrated poverty. And finally, I think we saw that localism is killing us. And this is a term that comes primarily out of local government law, but many of you may have seen it in your work and your studies. And I want to just make a quick distinction about localism. There is localism in the sense that get out of my community. There is localism in the sense of insiders and outsiders, and it can be expressed in a number of different attitudes which may or may not give rise to particular policies of exclusion. And then there is legal localism. And legal localism is the codification of that tendency toward exclusion, of that characterization of insiders and outsiders, and the institutionalization of power relationships that come as a result of it. Localism in New Orleans helped to kill hundreds and hundreds of people, displace thousands, and dispossess tens of thousands of their means. And so out of this come a few conclusions. We do need a greater focus on segregation. We need local government reform. We have to promote public participation in neighborhood planning. And the United New Orleans Planning Project, UNOP, is an interesting example that I just invite people to look at. It's imperfect, it's incomplete, but it is still very special and unprecedented in a city like New Orleans, because what it has done is it has invited citizen participation at the neighborhood level in thinking about the goals for the redevelopment of their community, as well as a sense of what that community really has to be. And we hear so much about sort of top-down decision-making in cities, and we hear so much about how the poor is marginalized in terms of voice. And when you think about a project as simple as that kind of a planning project on the neighborhood level, you see how important civic engagement is and how meaningful it can be in terms of political participation, political mobilizing and organization around some of the issues that were discussed in the earlier panel. And this one is new for me. We have to adopt a regionalist perspective on equitable transformation. I say I'm an urbanist. I am slowly becoming a regionalist. I am slowly coming around to the conclusion that it is virtually impossible for most large cities in this country, given their history and the status of their populations, particularly their poor, to do it on their own. And I also don't think that there is any measure of equity that can justify the degree of wealth that has moved to the suburbs and that has abandoned those cities and put them in that kind of systematic vulnerability without having to pay up at some level. And it's not just a question of retribution. It is also a question of political organization. And so regionalism becomes increasingly important, particularly for race scholars, not just for smart growth advocates. And finally, we have to develop, and relatedly, the interest convergence that is possible between low-income urban residents and middle-class suburban residents. The city-suburb idea has got to go, because it's far more complicated than that, and it implies too much distance. My thesis in the piece in After the Storm is that what is good for low-income people is actually good for middle-income people, but that turns on its head the whole ethos of spatial and residential organization in this country. Those are the conclusions. Now for the two observations that come through the research. First is, to my amazement, the conquests of Americanization in New Orleans. New Orleans, I say, is not especially exceptional, not now. It could have been. It is special culturally. It is rich and different and profound. But what marks New Orleans differently from any other city in this country is not just its relationship to slavery, but the complexity of class and race relationships that occurred there up until this conquest of Americanization. So that you had many different ways to be black, and you had many different ways to be white, and you had Creoles, and this definition of who was a Creole and what is a Creole was fabulously complex. And all of this complexity spelled the potential for a kind of urban pluralism and struggle that might have changed the way America did cities, but it lost. It was stamped out. And among its greatest defenders were actually people of color, radical Creoles of color. Among them, of course, Homer Plessy. So that we get Plessy versus Ferguson, we get organized Creole resistance to segregation, we get a robust Reconstruction, of course, prior to its backlash, within a city that as early as 1860 had a segregation index of 36. Today, it's about 71. So we lost on the cultural score because of the way race was socially constructed. And the sort of quickie example of this is what happened to Creoles. You had white Creoles who were very proud of their Creole status, eventually capitulating to the binary and becoming white. And you had so many black Creoles who today still try to cling to this, the distinction of their identity, nevertheless becoming raced, becoming black, like it or not, especially along most economic measures. So we lose that in a process of Americanization. We don't get the sort of segregation in New Orleans that you see today until much later in the game there than in most cities in this country. It doesn't really occur as a result, because of the climate, because of the difficulties in the land, and the need for technology to make certain areas livable. It doesn't really happen until after the post-war period. But when it happens with a vengeance. And that's that spatial expression of racial status differences that is the ultimate tangible expression of the first aspect of Americanization, this cultural capitulation to the racial binary. So that's the first thing, that we lose this uniqueness about New Orleans. And the second thing, though, is the recognition of how we lose this. And the way it came to me was not just in looking at the images of poor, very dark black people on rooftops and outside the Superdome, sweltering and being accused of all kinds of ungodly things, most of which proved to be untrue, when we should really be admiring them for their remarkable restraint under those circumstances. But the question of, where were the white people? Where were the white people? We know that it was an overwhelmingly black city, but it wasn't that overwhelmingly black. So the white people were on higher ground, is the short answer. The white people were on the suburban periphery. The city of New Orleans, the parish of New Orleans, is overwhelmingly black. The 6 or 7 parishes that surround the city of New Orleans are overwhelmingly white. And it's critical to think of New Orleans, like every other major city in this country, by its metropolitan area. Because the exodus of white people, beginning in the 1950s, is done, in my view, primarily as a response to desegregation, primarily as a response to Brown. And as they take up in these new communities, they have to maintain walls of resistance to the invasion, in their view, of undesirables And undesirables have always been coded as black. There are many different means and many different modes of being undesirable. The first and foremost means, the most consistent, the one that Professor Hernandez talked about in Latino-black relations, has always been the coding of black as undesirable first. It is part of the continuing Americanization process. It is codified in legal localism. And so what happens in the 1960s and the 1970s through state law cases is the codification of race-neutral rules that have the benefit of economic rationalism and professionalized land use planning around this ideology of local control, saying we can do what we want with the land. We can decide who can live here. We can decide whom to exclude. And as long as we do it in a racially neutral manner, the fact that this doctrine becomes the even more durable and more effective successor to segregation is legally impenetrable. There are many critiques of localism by brilliant scholars like Richard Briffaut, Cheryl Cashin. They talk about primarily the problem of interlocal wealth disparities as a result of it. There is a world of fascinating disparity to be studied. What I hope that I am offering by this observation about New Orleans and its similarity to so many metropolitan areas around the country is that legal localism is not just a killer, it is the primary defense of segregation in this country. It should concern us dramatically, and we don't focus enough on it. But there's a silver lining in that sense. The silver lining is the possibility of political alliance and interest convergence. Because as it turns out, not all is well in the suburbs. As we've become a more suburbanized nation, we've come to recognize the differences between the outer ring suburbs, where there's so much wealth concentration and an investment in public resources, fiscal disparities at the state level, so that these terrific suburbs and places to live with their low tax bases are being subsidized by what? The inner ring suburbs. And the inner ring suburbs don't have anything like the capacity, say, of cities to raise money. So they are declining at an even faster rate than the cities that they are adjacent to. Therein lies some real political possibility. Therein lies the possibility of some sort of regional governance that focuses on the equity issues that benefit those low and moderate income inner ring suburban residents, many of whom are white, but who are watching their communities decline relative to outer ring suburbs that they are subsidizing. Now, ultimately, as lawyers, as advocates, there are a number of questions that we have to ask about the appropriateness of remedies. And as always, we have this choice of approaches: frontal attacks on racial inequity with the implications for whether we go to we mount a federal attack, a state attack, especially when it appears that we're fighting against a kind of a privatization of authority, or law reform that's aimed at economic inequity, in particularly those fiscal disparities I just described, but translating into anti-sprawl, smart growth, environmental degradation, traffic and transportation efficiencies, those kinds of things. I say this just to drop it out there, because this is the language of regionalism and the advocacy that may be possible. Many of us in this room have not thought very deeply about these things, but when you ask yourself what happened to New Orleans, it seems to me you cannot look much farther than these intrinsic problems of a kind of a structural racism masquerading as localism, masquerading as the American dream. Thank you.
Dr. Gandy.
Thank you. Like everyone, I'd like to express my appreciation for having been invited to this historic conference. I want to thank Jerry Kong for perhaps suggesting my name. I want to thank Cheryl for accepting the recommendation. I want to thank Saul for his unstinting hospitality and his attention to detail. It's been a very impressive show of organization. This is not my first time at a law school. I've been a number of times before, but it was under very different circumstances. My identity is that of a privacy scholar, so I'm really, again, really pleased to be here with regard to critical race studies. I'm also nervous being here. I'm pleased to see that some other legal scholars are pretty much tied to their text. I'm very tied to my text, but I have the able timekeeper here, so I will use her cues in order to help me edit my comments in order to get us through the time that I have. What I want to do with the time that I have is to tell you a little bit about frames and framing, about their importance for public policy. I want to introduce some of the complications that arise from the insights that the social and cognitive psychologists have to offer us. Then I want to explore some of the ways in which the framing research that I've done can be applied to a multidimensional crisis that we call Katrina. As scholars, we think about frames and framing in three ways, but first I want to establish that frames are ways of seeing and interpreting information about some phenomenon. Frames are descriptive, evaluative, they're associative, they filter, they amplify, they distort aspects of communication. These are the ways that I and my colleagues in communication usually study them. First, the most pedestrian approach to the analysis of frames focuses on their character. This is a descriptive and perhaps an analytical characterization of the frames that are produced and distributed by some source. Most of us think, however, that framing should be understood as a process that we can explore in terms of the selection and communication of frames by communicators, by journalists and editors, for example. We understand frames as resources that are used by these communicators. They can select them in the construction of a message. We're interested in understanding the nature of the constraints and I guess the enablements that let some communicators favor some frames over others. This is a focus on production, where the media are studied as the source of the frames. Here the frames are, if you'll allow, the dependent variables, and the researchers are interested in identifying the factors that predict or explain what sorts of frames in which media or which media actors are likely to use or provide. We ask the question about whether race or class or gender of the source might predict or explain which frames are going to be offered by that source. We're interested in seeing how the frames offered by particular sources change over time or circumstance. Or we're interested in the ways, for example, that a politician says different things depending upon the character of the audience that they are speaking to. We might even explore larger changes, the kinds of cultural changes that would allow somebody named Don Imus to think he could get away, all right, with calling black athletes hoes. All right? What's the changes that make that possible in his mind? But framing is also a process that we can explore at the site of reception. This is a concern about the cognitive, the affective, or the behavioral influence of frames. Here we're concerned with the results. Here we're concerned with the impact of framing attempts on that the communicators might have intended or might have affected some unintended audiences. We want to understand framing then in the context of a causal hypothesis where frames can be both independent and dependent variables. This approach is the basis for understanding frames and framing is implicated in the social construction of reality. Frames and framing are part of a process that my mentor, George Gerbner, defined as cultivation. We're interested in determining which frames are likely to influence the perception of the attitudes, the behavior of particular segments of the audience. We're especially interested in understanding how exposure to particular frames influences perceptions of people, and more importantly, I would say for today, public policies. Cognitive scientists are concerned with understanding how frames are involved in the processing of information, including how frames activate existing biases that limit the range of likely interpretations of the data or information that are provided. Social psychologists are also interested in understanding the group correlates or predictors of differential responses to frames. Group membership and group identification helps to predict or explain why readers that are defined by race and class and gender are going to interpret the same message but differently. I'll provide some examples of these approaches to framing before turning specifically to the framing of Katrina and the aftermath. So we care about framing because of its consequences. Framing shapes our understanding of the social problems and the public policies that are developed in response to these problems. framing shapes the way we understand the seriousness of a problem. We know that the seriousness of a problem varies with the identification and the characterization of the victims. Our response to policy options also varies with the responsibility or the blame that's been assigned. It's important for our analysis of Katrina victims and Katrina discourse to examine the frames that shape our attributions of responsibility. A prime distinction amongst causal attributions for hardship and misfortune is between situational factors. It was the environment, or it was the structure, or it was external, rather than dispositional explanations, that is internal or cultural or personal explanations for what happens. With regard to Katrina, a Pew survey in 2005 indicated that black people were more likely to make situational or external attributions of responsibility, while whites were more likely to make distributional attributions. It's in their nature, was what people said as an explanation. Now, we can be guided in our examination of Katrina frames by other kinds of policy-relevant analyses. I've been particularly interested in, you didn't put the tail, did you? Oh my God, okay. Let me do this short bit. I mean, media frames shape health policy debate, and I really want to talk about that. I'm going to St. Louis next week to talk about health policy, but I guess I want to give credit to Regina Lawrence. Regina Lawrence has done a really nice analysis about the way framing of obesity as a problem has changed over time. The way in which it was framed first as an individual problem, and then it was framed as a structural or environmental problem in which the advertisers and marketers were assigned some blame or responsibility. But even though the Institute of Medicine has recently come out with a report that talks about, well, it's kind of their advertisers' responsibility, we're back now to a mixed explanation for where the responsibility lies in that regard. I'm inviting you all to consider the same kind of, if you will, transformation or modification of the nature of the dominant frames, right, which shape our understanding of responsibility and the kinds of policies that might be supported in response to Katrina. I'm going to leave for Jerry and his colleagues to talk about cognitive science and framing and specification and the like. I want to say something about markets. It's really important for us to understand, right, the ways in which the choices that are made by communicators, by the media, vary as a function of the characteristics of the markets. It matters who the primary or target readers are. It also matters what the characteristics of those who select, those who write the headlines, right, those who locate those stories in those media, whether or not it varies as a function of the race, class, or status of the targets and the producers of that content. That's as much as I can say, I guess, about structure in that regard. Part of what I want to tell you about is our analysis of Katrina. We did an analysis, Chu, Lee, and I, with regard to the portrayal of Katrina frames by the New York Times and the Washington Post. This was a strategic selection, not only because they are important newspapers of record, but we wanted to find out whether or not there was something about the way in which a New York paper, given the staff of the New York Times, and I'll do it again like Megan did, talk about Chocolate City, Washington, D.C., the original Chocolate City, all right, and the nature of the staff and the nature of the audience, and whether or not the story is told differently in those two cities as a function of the staff and as a function of who the important audiences were. So that was part of the reason for our analysis. We observed that the Washington Post provided marginally more sympathetic representations of black victims and rescuers than the Times. And again, we want to say that this was explained in part by the Post's more racially inclusive staff, as well as by the character of the city. So let's talk about, in the minutes that I have left, the impact of Katrina frames. It's important to study Katrina because of the nature of the story. If we want to understand something about frames, not just about Katrina frames, and I'm a communications scholar and I want to study about frames in general, in order to do what? In order to mobilize and to help people know where to intervene. So Katrina is important to study as a case study because it was almost as important in terms of capturing public attention as 9/11. All right, this was a very special story. 70% of the people that were asked by Pew said they spent a lot of time watching this study. And so if there are any kind of responses at all, it's going to be in response to a story like this that was framed. We're not surprised that racial differences in public responses, Katrina, were so prominent. 70% of the black people who responded to Pew's survey said they were angry by the government's response, while only 46% of white respondents said that they were angry. All right, so same event, but two different constructions of people had dramatically different kinds of responses at the level of, is this a bad thing and should we be angry? Substantially fewer whites, 37%, than blacks, 77%, reported being bothered by the usage of refugees to define people displaced by Katrina. 2/3 of black respondents believed that the government would have responded more quickly if the victims were white, while only 17% of white respondents thought that this was so. All right, so again, we're all exposed to the same representations. Why is there this dramatic disparity in the response to and the interpretation of what do these representations mean? With regard to the framing of behavior as criminal, the racial divide in opinion was substantial. Black respondents were more likely than whites, 57% to 38%, to agree that people who took things from homes and businesses were just ordinary people trying to survive, while white respondents were more likely than blacks to say that they were mostly criminals taking advantage of the situation. Again, same representation. How do we get different kinds of understandings about what went on? The racial differences with regard to reported violence were even more striking, with black respondents nearly twice as likely to associate violence with desperate conditions than whites, who overwhelmingly emphasized criminal identity. If we study the relationship between media exposure and attributions of responsibility, it's going to be important to take note, though, of which media sources were being relied upon. So my mentor, George Gerbner, God rest his soul, was of the view that all media were the same and all the messages were the same, but we know better than that. All right, we know that there are different media, and the different media might use the same pictures, but the commentary is going to be different. So the framing by those respondents, either with written or with verbal or raised eyebrows or chuckles or whatever it is, that are used in order to accent and reinterpret those images, there are going to be some differences. It's clear that Fox News provides a more conservative framework to its audience. Indeed, the Pew data suggested that Fox viewers were more likely than those that relied upon other television networks to agree that people taking things were criminals. All right, so Fox presented that very special message. It's also interesting that people who relied upon the internet for their news were more likely to explain the behavior as a reflection of criminal dispositions. They were also more likely to report an intention to donate or to respond favorably to those victims. So it matters which media were used and which media were relied upon. I would really love to be able to do the kind of analysis that Pew data usually provide in order to do this kind of closely textured analysis in order to understand. So part of the kind of engagement that the green eye shades folks, that is the numbers crunchers, do is to say, how can I engage in this process of specification? Can I understand the differences within the black population? All right, how do I understand those African Americans that agreed apparently with the majority of the white population? What explained this aberrant behavior? Is it because they were spending time in the Fox environment, or is it some other way that explains the ways in which people depart from the norm? The size of the sample that Pew reported was only 1,000, and it doesn't have, therefore, the kind of statistical power that would allow us to explore those kinds of explanations. But those are the kinds of things that the kind of analysis that we do of the frames, and not on multiple frames across media and across markets, and responses across media and across markets, allow us to understand and perhaps engage in this process of attribution, that is, assign some responsibility to the people who make decisions, because they have to be made to bear responsibility for the responses of their audiences to those subjects. I've abused your generosity. Let me stop now and allow my colleagues to make their contribution.
Professor Harris.
Thank you. I'm sorry, David, could you hand me the mouse?
The mouse.
Okay. So I have many, many thoughts about Katrina, many of which were inspired by the work that our students did. I want to start, I guess, with a point of departure that I've been trying to work through here, which is thinking about the relationship between terror and disaster. My point of departure is to try to think about not only the Gulf in Iraq, but the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and what the relationship between those two might be. Post 9/11, I want to suggest that Reconstruction, terror, and disaster have come to some kind of crossroads, a place of convergence, although not a place to be celebrated. To some extent, terror and disaster might be seen as mutually constitutive. That is, terror produces disaster, and disaster produces terror. But at even a more fundamental level, I guess what I want to point out is that this war that we are in, this endless war, has swallowed up most other articulations of legitimate state objectives. And I don't mean this in just the figurative sense. I think I mean this literally. So that even prior to Katrina, FEMA, the principal agency charged with disaster relief, had been absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security. So we have here a structural move which basically locates disaster relief as part of Homeland Security. So disaster becomes, or the management of disaster becomes part of the framework of national security in response to terror, and relief and reconstruction get rooted in the same premises. That is, relief and reconstruction are rooted in the premise that, like the war on disaster, what the post-Katrina landscape required was a war on disaster. And so you have the same techniques, the same presumptions, indeed the same firms, Halliburton, etc., hired and deployed with the same result. First came the disaster, or in the case of Iraq, the war. Then comes the disaster in the wake of the disaster, or in the case of Iraq, the war in the wake of the war. So months before Katrina, Naomi Klein in The Nation authored an article really prescient entitled The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, in which she argued that the perpetual preemptive war was also perpetual preemptive reconstruction. And that this reconstruction was really a neoconservative dream. Quote, where there is destruction, there is reconstruction, or a chance to grab hold of the terrible barrenness, as a UN official recently described the destruction in Aceh, and fill it in with the most beautiful, perfect plans. So she's quoting a UN official in the wake of the tsunami describing what the destruction has brought. It's brought opportunity. Condoleezza described it this way. Quote, the tsunami is a wonderful opportunity that has paid great dividends for us. Echoing this sentiment after Katrina, the chairman of the New Orleans Business Council put it this way. We have been brainstorming about how to use this catastrophe as a once-in-an-eon opportunity to change the dynamic. As reported by Klein, a researcher from Focus on the Global South put it this way. This is a critic speaking back to these assessments. Quote, we used to have vulgar colonialism. Now we have sophisticated colonialism, and they call it reconstruction. It's not reconstruction at all. It's about reshaping everything. Close quote. So to some extent, exposés of contractor incompetence, overcharging, corruption, miss the fact that the primary purposes of these reconstruction projects are not reconstruction, as we might commonly perceive it. What we are witnessing, according to Klein, is, quote, the rise of a predatory form of disaster capitalism that uses the desperation and fear created by catastrophe to engage in radical social and economic engineering. So My thesis then is that both war and natural disasters, be it hurricanes or tsunamis, provide an opportunity for the revival of the ideal colonial project on land that has now been cleared of troublesome people, institutional impediments. As Klein describes it, it's the recreation of terra nullius. Iraq, New Orleans, Aceh, all become laboratories for a range of initiatives in which the government makes massive transfers of the public fisc to politically connected contractors under a no-bid process, and simultaneously, and this is I think the point that was brought home by the work that our students did in New Orleans, the creation of a regulatory void. So it's not state action in the usual sense that we think of as state action. It's actually state action by absence. The blueprint for Katrina then was actually laid out by the Heritage Foundation at a meeting on September 13th. Now, actually, some of the things that Heritage laid out had already taken place. So I don't think that this report from Heritage was the first time this had surfaced, but the report was called Pro-Free Market Ideas for Responding to Hurricane Katrina and High Gas Prices. So at the Heritage Foundation on September 13th, which was roughly 2 weeks after the hurricane, 100 conservative lawmakers heard suggestions for hurricane relief that included school vouchers, repealing environmental regulations, and drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. The list also included the repeal of the Prevailing Wage Act, the creation of a Gulf Flat Tax Enterprise Zone, and a regional, quote, economic competitiveness zone in which regulations would be waived. Now, this is exactly what our students found when they arrived, a regulatory void. OSHA, the agency charged with worker safety, had exempted counties in Louisiana and Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama from enforcement status. They also, months after the hurricane, even though this was supposed to be under the rubric of emergency, they were still exempt. The cumulative effect of all of this was basically to evacuate the government's responsibility for public health and welfare. And noticeably, this evacuation was far more effective than the failed evacuation of New Orleans itself. The initial abandonment was actually, I argue, superseded by a second evacuation, the creation of the necessary preconditions for the reconstruction of New Orleans as a city in which blacks were, quote, the minority community. As the CEO of the Greater New Orleans community described black people. So Katrina provided an opportunity to roll out the apparatus of disaster relief as military occupation. And here in the Reconstruction Project, race, and more specifically blackness, played a very significant role. Katrina, of course, exposed racial fissures in a city which had been 67% black, and it did so on terms which initially, at least in the wake of Katrina, challenged some of the prevailing understandings of race. That is, our prevailing understanding under colorblindness is basically one in which the argument is not that notions of biological inferiority explain black disadvantage, but that cultural dysfunction explains black disadvantage. So the issue is not blood, but behavior. Were black people to engage in appropriate conduct, go to school, avoid drugs, work hard, resist crime, save money, they would basically get fixed and transcend their current social status. In the wake of Katrina, you had a challenge to this narrative. And here I want to connect with Oscar's observations about frames. So if we think about colorblindness, we have colorblindness as a kind of metaframe in which we understand race, and Katrina as a kind of epic event that challenges it. Now, it's not the case that frames are static. Frames are always sort of under revision, under challenge. My own limited understanding of it is that because they are so complex, they often actually are working in contradiction. But I want to begin now, if I can, with the iconic photographs that you no doubt have all seen as a way of sort of thinking about frames. If I can get it. Let's see. Well, this is the part that's always hard. Down.
Folder right there.
There we go. There we go. You all saw these. Yeah, we all know these. And here are the headings. Sorry, I can't get them all on the same page here. I probably have to change the view, but in any event, let's see. The first one is of a young black man wading through the water. Let's see if we can get this one there. Let's see if we can scroll it down for me. Let's see. The first one is of a young black man wading through the water. The heading basically says that he has just recently looted a grocery store. Yeah, there we go. The second one, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. So these 2 images appeared on Yahoo September 1st, like immediately after the storm. And almost immediately there was a big controversy over this very question. Lots of blog entries about this. For the most part, though, the controversy focused on a question of fact. Was this accurate? Did the black man loot? Did the white people find? And so the way of resolving the issue was to go and ask the photographers, what did you see? So the photographer at the AP suggested that's the first picture, said, quote, he saw the person go into the shop and take the goods. That's why he wrote looting in the caption. In other words, the fact of the matter is that he saw that man loot those goods. On the other hand, the photographer of image B, Christopher Graythan, said, I wrote the caption about the 2 people who found the items. I believed, in my opinion, that they did simply find them and not looted them in the definition of the word. The people were swimming in chest-deep water, and there were other people in the water, both white and black. I looked for the best picture. There were 1 million items floating in the water. We were right near a grocery store that had 5 feet of water in it. It had no doors. The water was moving, and the stuff was floating away. These people were not ducking into a store and busting down windows to get electronics. They picked up breads and cokes that were floating in the water. They would have floated away anyhow. So the argument here is that this is an accurate depiction, right? These headings accurately frame or depict or tell us what the script is, or tell us what the pictures mean. But I guess I want to say that, to my way of thinking, this raises a very interesting set of questions about the relationships between facts and frames. It turns out that facts are really important, empirical research is crucial, but the question of, as Oscar has pointed out, about how the information is framed means everything in terms of our understanding. Because what mediates between facts and social reality is a natural activity that we all engage in, interpretation, and frames have a lot to do with that. So my simple-minded sort of understanding of frames is it answers the question of what is going on here, right? And typically what we are doing when our frames are activated is we're saying, oh, I know that story. I know what that story is. I've seen that story before. Now, as I mentioned, epic events move and challenge our frames. Now, if we'll recall the photographer's explanation of the second photograph, I think it's interesting, and this is where Devin and I went with this essay, is that it's really not about the question of what did the photographers see precisely. Certainly that's important, but that's not only it. The question is, how did this photograph get selected? And in this regard, the remarks of Graythan, the photographer of the second photo, are actually quite compelling. He says that he looked for the best picture. Now, more specifically, that means he searched for an image that would tell the story, particularly the story that he was trying to tell, that the people were wading through the water looking for food. Now, according to Graythan, there were both white and black people in the water. It was one of the few racially integrated spaces. And he searched around in this racially integrated space for a picture that would most successfully convey the story he was trying to tell, which was that there were people wading in the water finding food. So his best picture, his, oh yeah, that one, I know that story picture, emerged when he saw 2 white people, which he photographed in image B, because he realized that that would best tell the story he was trying to tell. Now, one can infer from that decision that it was easier to frame whites in that way than it would have been to frame black people that way, and Graythan's choice implicitly recognized that there would be a dissonance between the image of the first one, in which you wrote under it, black man finds food and water, right? That just doesn't map. In part because of this difference, I guess I want to say that I'm not really suggesting that Graythan's decision was racially conscious, that is in the sense of intentionally motivated by race. What I am saying is that he was acting out of and actually producing and responding to a set of frames, a set of racial framings that he understood without even having to be articulated. He understood what the stereotype of black criminality that would be activated by the first picture, regardless of whether there was any heading under it or not. So in the immediate aftermath, we have this whole debate about law and order. And my argument is, the one that Devin and I make, is that you have a basically shift in the focus from rescue to occupation. And the mission then changes in part as a result of the kinds of frames that are activated. Now, in the main, what happens is that you have assistance being denied not only to people in New Orleans, but to people trying to escape New Orleans. People turned away at gunpoint in Gretna. All of these are very well-known stories by now. And even interestingly, you have the police and law enforcement and even mayors of the city sort of buying into the notion that it had to be a military occupation, not a rescue, simply because of the danger involved. In fact, Reagan spoke of, quote, hundreds of armed gang members killing and raping people inside the dome, such that the crowd had descended into what he described as an almost animalistic state. Now, this is a black man describing his citizens, the people he presumably represents. Now, my point is not that there was no violence, but my point is that the frame of law and order overdetermined how we interpreted both the extent and the nature of that violence and how we constructed the response or non-response. And specifically to make this concrete, consider how the facts about rape were interpreted and discussed. In the wake of what happened in Katrina, advocacy groups for victims of sexual assault challenged the official count, which immediately in the wake of the storm reported only 4 rapes, as really unrealistically low. And a national database that was created shortly after the storm actually reported over 150 post-Katrina violent crimes, of which about a third were sexual assaults, including those that were committed in the homes of host families. This suggests that sexual assaults were severely underreported, but paradoxically at the same time the media was citing reports of rape to confirm stereotypes of black criminality, the black female victims of actual rapes were unable to actually report them. That is, nobody wanted to hear what the victims of the actual rapes had to say. So while accounts of rapes were being invoked as signs of disintegration of social order in New Orleans, many of the black women who experienced sexual violence reported that they were actually unable and discouraged from filing reports with law enforcement. One of the most prominent examples of this was actually Charmaine Neville. Charmaine Neville is a member of the Neville family, a renowned New Orleans musical family. She was raped in the lower 9 by a group of roving black men while she and her neighbors had been unsuccessful over a period of days in trying to evacuate some of her elderly neighbors and seek medical care. Her account of this incident is a clear indictment of the governmental neglect in the aftermath of Katrina. She said, quote, "What I want people to understand is that if we hadn't been left down there like the animals that they were treating us like, all those things wouldn't have happened." The only reason that her report came to light was in part because she happened to be at a local TV station when the member of the Catholic Archdiocese of New Orleans was in the studio, and she told her story to him, and that's the only way that it got on the air. Now, I want to be clear that we are not excusing the conduct of the rapist nor blaming that conduct on the government. My point is simply, if that the overall governmental response in the aftermath of Katrina, shaped as it was by the racial frame of law and order, created conditions of increased danger of rape because it caused the government to once again evacuate rather than rescue. I don't mean evacuate the people, I mean evacuate the rescue apparatus. as well as an increased likelihood that those rapes would be unaddressed. So problematically, you have the invocation of rapes as a sign of the animalistic nature of the people in New Orleans, but their injuries were really only abstractions. They weren't, in fact, seriously taken into account. So the bottom line here, I guess for me, is that where we come down to is trying to think about what is the relationship between facts and frames. What is the relationship between the empirical and the interpretive? And the tragic consequences of Katrina providing us a moment through which we might reflect upon both the possibilities and the impediments to a broader and more just social consensus about race, class, and rights. I think that what we can figure out, or we might begin with, is that in order to shift racial frames, you have to be grounded in a broader orientation than raw empiricism. What's required is actually attention to social organization and social movements that open up the space for reframing. Thank you.
I want to thank Cheryl for giving me the opportunity as the moderator to actually add a few brief comments, because what I'm going to talk about is really the interconnections among race, emotions, mental health, and Katrina. I come to you as a trained clinical psychologist who also has a degree in health services and does health policy. I've done quite a bit of mental health service provision post-disasters like Rodney King and others. So this is one of the things that, for me, I take quite seriously. Now, what happened in Katrina for many racial, ethnic, and immigrant groups was emotionally more significant. Dr. Gandy began to talk about research, and what the research tells us is that when we ask questions about the impact of what went on in Katrina in terms of from an emotional, affective point of view, this was actually more impactful for ethnic minorities than it was for whites. And part of that is because the emotions of Katrina are not just those of a disaster, but part of what we know is that these emotions are rooted in a history of neglect and racism. They open up some very old wounds. They tend to bring people into a place of conflict. While all of us know and can stand and tell stories of what happened to individuals, today what we're here to do is to talk about critical race studies. And critical race studies should really be compelling us to analyze what we witness in a manner that respects but also tends to transcend these individual issues. We all know the sadness of the individual tragedy, but if we are to enact new policies, if we are to ensure that there is disaster law that is appropriate, that says never again, that it means that we must transcend the individual pain that we are often quite able to talk about. In the work of thinking about disaster response and disaster preparedness, it's important, from my perspective, to really understand mental health. For mental health is that which supports our soul. Mental health is that which tends to ignite our passions to thrive and to survive. And it is our mental health and our emotional well-being that causes us to want to live for another day in a way in which we begin to interact with people in a positive way. Emotional well-being is what helps us to create and sustain our passions for community, for culture, and for relationships. And so these are, and they really should be, the building blocks when we talk about recovery and rebuild efforts. These also should be the points of argument, I think, for making people whole, for breaking and reconstituting some of the contractual decisions that were made during the aftermath of Katrina, Wilma, and Rita, because not everyone was whole when these decisions were made, nor were they in their right mind, but yet it was demanded that they act, and they act quickly. In mental health, what we do is we recognize at times when a crime is committed that that crime may actually be a byproduct of feelings of hopelessness, of feeling helpless, and even of a reflection of a nation in which some people just can't get a decent house, a decent job. They pay more for a loan than others. In New Orleans, they called in the state troopers, and the state troopers came in to deal with this increase in crime with no thought of trying to address the reason for the crime. I was in New Orleans, for example, when a man was killed by what we often call suicide by cop. He knew that in challenging the police he was going to get killed. This man instead was labeled as being violent and not as desperate. He was not labeled, for example, in the sense of there was something that he needed and no way to get it and found a way out of his pain. No one talked about, for example, what was needed to make him whole and to act as a human being. I was also in New Orleans as my center, and a whole crew of us trained over 200 mental health providers, 30-something clergy, and we met with the community about their children. And because at that time there were something like 7,000 children who were not in school, and they were about to go back to school that August for the first time in a year. And we heard stories of suicides from these individuals. We heard stories, for example, of the very things that Cheryl just talked about, some of the violence that had occurred. I also sat and listened to some of the stories from providers who shared with me how close they were, for example, to killing themselves, how some just felt like there was no more relief in sight and all that they were doing was helping, but that there was not a broader framework of help. These are stories around losses, and these are stories not just about floods. They're stories about people for whom they saw how the race card was being played and felt that America didn't care about them and that there was no relief in sight. Kanye said the truth that some people were just too tired to utter. Much in my field has been discussed about the need for early intervention, for example, for those exposed to mass violence in the form of shootings. We often talk about shootings that occur in schools or workplace, and even these mass violence in terms of terrorist acts. Well, some of us argue that this definition of mass violence does not take into account what may also be experienced as terrorist acts by the police and systems of the government that are experienced as violating your rights with no care or concern, interrogating you about your behavior, but yet quite slow to respond when you ask for anything that you think is within your rights to have. Recent research in the field of psychology, for example, has shown that shooters involved in Columbine and other mass killings at schools were actually victims. They were victims of being bullied. They were victims of being excluded and socially isolated. As children, we're often told that sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but names may never hurt me. Well, this is not true, and for every media event in Katrina that characterized African Americans as looting and whites as feeding their family is another one of those hurts. Those of us who study the impact of race discrimination on physical and mental health call this a daily hassle. It's a daily hassle which becomes such a chronic way of life for African Americans that before we even see a full act of discrimination, we know what's about to come. And our brain is there to warn us that there is a sense of threat and evil. Whether that action is truly discriminatory or not, the feeling of being under siege for some of us is continuous. We have begun as researchers to try to start documenting how social pain and social exclusion are the basis for negative physical and mental health outcomes. But it won't be until you as lawyers cause somebody to pay for social pain that America's going to take it serious. So see, my research needs you. My interest in being here today really is in working across the disciplines in the hope that mental health aspects of disasters are considered by my colleagues in law. As an example, those of us in mental health are quite clear that the demands on individuals to make decisions about their property, where they were to live again in New Orleans, how to build, requires emotional well-being and resiliency that has yet to occur because of the lack of focus on creating mental health early in the disaster. In thinking about how to help, colleagues and I began to work with individuals who left the Gulf region about what to expect when they returned home and how to make decisions and what to do. However, there were a lot of people that we didn't reach. And for them, they went raw still from the devastation of the way in which the evacuations were done, angry, untrusting about the system, which is to be the source of the rebuild for them. And then when they arrived and saw what was for them a way of life, a sense of community, a dream devastated and destroyed, they walked away. They walked away because they did not have the inner strength, the emotional well-being, the ability to be able to envision or dream again about a new way of life there. That's lost property. While we have laws that often say the sale or purchase can be reversed within a particular time period, that's for little small penny ante things we're beginning to understand. And we need to actually consider that in those purchases and the walking away from property, people who settled with the insurance company, now clearly some of whom were not in their right minds, there was no protection for them. We need you as lawyers to listen to us as mental health providers to say, what are the decision-making protections that should be put into place when there are major disasters? We had individuals who were on a plane for the first time in their lives and resettled as far away as Alaska. We know that some left bodies of their dead parents reluctantly, and they were shipped away. We know that some individuals lost large segments of their family, and that decisions were made that were considered irreversible with no recourse. We need your help. There are too many bright minds and dedicated passions in this room to let this continue to be the way that we operate. For it is the weakest, those of color, and the most vulnerable for whom these lifelong heartaches influence their ability to make decisions and rebuild in the face of disasters. Immigrants, racial and ethnic minorities, we often consider ourselves as proud people, people with resiliency who can bounce back from anything. Well, let us not embrace this stereotype to the detriment of those who not only need mental health services, but they need legal protections. I'm hoping that my colleagues in this room will think about race and disaster law and disaster preparedness response, because to me it is a crime emotionally that those in our community have taken their lives because of the things that have happened to them, because of the ways in which there appeared to be no recourse, because of the ways in which they were separated from their children, from members of their family, and told that it was all under the name of the government knew best. When the government in a time of emergency says, I know better than you, what will save you is only to ignore them, but yet, as people of color, to ignore them means we may lose our life. So again, some people feel broken, violated, and have great difficulty recovering. It's my hope that we can talk across interdisciplinary lines about understanding what things like distress do to people's behavior, understanding what post-traumatic stress disorder really is, and for how for some it may leave such emotional disability that it is appropriate for us to consider this in awards, compensation, or federal systems of support. The last time we ignored the true weight of post-traumatic stress disorder was in the men and women who came back to our communities from Vietnam. Let us not make the same mistake in Katrina. Thank you. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. There are a couple of mics. Please feel free to come up, line up in front of them. Jerry?
I'll just ask a quick question. Cheryl started off by comparing terrorism and I guess 9/11 obviously with Katrina. I'm going to try to suggest a different comparison, one that Professor Oliver raised in some sense of Los Angeles, right? Koreans call it Saigu, 1992 when Los Angeles burned. That is another crisis. The causes of it look different, at least on its face. And so I want to just offer that up as an interesting way to compare it. So one concrete question, for example, for Oscar could be, as you think about the framing and the media framing that was very, very powerful, certainly in the Los Angeles riots, as compared to the framing that's happening post-Katrina, is it just the same set of theory and the same sorts of data collection that apply to two very interesting media-worthy stories, and that the nature of the scholarship and the findings and our insights are actually not that different? It's just that it's two different things that are going on, and we could run the same analytic machinery and find different data, but it's nothing really new. There's nothing really new from what we learned back then to now, or did you find something profoundly different? Like, for example, our tendency to suggest that there are dispositionist answers or explanations explanations for the kind of behavior. Well, what did the white media think of both the Korean gun-toting merchants and the black and largely invisible, at least in the media, Latinos who were involved in some of the actions in the places where stores were most hurt? So I want to see if there's a comparison. I mean, the comparison is implicit, but no one talked about it directly, and I really did want to hear your thoughts about it.
Thank you, Jerry. It's important to recognize the difference in those two events in terms of things that were discussed in two prior panels in terms of conflict, right? So the kind of conflict between group identified people was certainly greater in the Los Angeles moment than it was in Katrina. So I don't think that we would ask the question, all right, about conflict. The questions that were asked of the text was about the behavior of people, whether or not they were active or passive, whether or not they were engaged in helping behavior, or whether or not they were engaged in criminal behavior. But much of the criminal behavior was own group behavior rather than across a racial or ethnic boundary in that regard. So in terms of the kind of reasonable questions we could ask of the impact of the frames, I don't think those would be two good cases, so we couldn't have everything is the same kind of response.
Can I also make a response? One of the things that happened in terms of the media was that it focused on black and white. And for those of us who either work down there or we know our census data very well, there were Latinos, there were Vietnamese, and there were Cambodians, and particularly in terms of Latinos that even came from other places to there. One indictment that really occurred was around communication in terms of messages around disaster and how they were very narrow and how they didn't take into account how other people lived, what other people did. So if we look at a broad interpretation of the framing, it really missed big time some very important issues. And those have come after Katrina, I think, in terms of the discussion that's taking place, so that we're trying not to make it black and white any longer, which is what I think, despite, for example, that we occasionally would talk about the Koreans here, that it really has stayed on a national level, a black-white dialogue around the civil disturbance here.
I want to say something quickly to it. I'm glad you asked the question because it gives me an opportunity just to state for the record how ubiquitous framing I think is in the way that we think generally. Because I think that this is a matter of cognitive psychology. It's how we know the world, and it'd be impossible for us to function if we weren't in some ways able to construct these cognitive bins of reference rather than simply confronting everything anew. But part of the problem with the whole idea of framing is the suggestion of this kind of postmodern nebulousness where everything is relative, and your frame is as good as my frame. Having said that, however, I do want to distinguish one important characteristic of the analyses, the public analyses of the King verdict uprising, which I happen to be here for, and Katrina. And one is that in the uprising, there was absolutely no question that this was about conflict. And you could frame it differently, but it was always about conflict. And part of the struggle that we've had, and part, in fact, of the genesis of the After the Storm book, was the tendency of black intellectuals, and frankly legal intellectuals generally, to see things through conflict and see the possibility of transformation through conflict. So it's that absence of a conflict framing in New Orleans that we also see through this kind of fall off of the public discourse on race and class that I think has damned our understanding and bankrupted the possibility of a larger recovery.
I want to thank the panel for the great presentations. I wonder if you could think along with us about how we might be able to make the events around Hurricane Katrina a lock-in moment of another kind, a way in which when I go around the country and talk to community groups or fair housing groups, the narrative sounds more like you than it does what's on television and what the political system is able to deal with. There's been a fundamental understanding, I think, of at the very least, a breach of faith on the part of the government and a failure of the kind of free market fundamentalism to solve problems on its own. And I wonder what kinds of conversations we can be part of, both in terms of legal defense around various prosecutions, the Danziger Bridge prosecution and others that are going on right now, in terms of helping communities, the people in Houston and Atlanta especially, to engage in discussions. And I wonder if it would be possible to make the right to return, the right to rebuild, the right to have democratic participation in the future of New Orleans in some ways be a lock-in moment for a new discussion about the 14th Amendment, a new discussion about democracy in the U.S.
George, you've stated a great answer in the form of a question. That's pretty good. I think that for all of my critique at the front end, I actually do think, and I hesitate to sound too overly optimistic, but I actually think that the contradictions brought up by Katrina actually have a lot to do with why we have seen a glacial, marginal, but nevertheless perceptible change in terms of just straight up normal electoral politics. And what I mean by that is to say that when, I think Jerry and I talked about this at the moment in the wake of Katrina, when you saw the National Guard troops from Louisiana having to be brought back from Iraq back to their counties in Louisiana that had been completely devastated, there was a moment in which there was a powerful linkage being made between the bankruptcy of U.S. domestic social policy and U.S. foreign policy. I think that that has been partly the beginning of the turn against the war. Now, what this fundamentally means in terms of long-term policy, all of this is still very much up for grabs. But I would actually mark that as a signature moment. This connection that people start to make between where is the National Guard? The National Guard is in Iraq. What is the National Guard doing in Iraq? We need the National Guard here. This sort of fundamental thing, I think, did make a difference. Now, that's not to say that I disagree at all with David's assessment that there's a way in which the race and class dimensions of this are still deeply submerged. So you have this sort of promised sort of focus on race and class, but I still don't think it's happened. But I do think that going concretely to your question as well, there's actually some very, very fascinating and powerful litigation going on in New Orleans right now by the usual suspects, I guess I should call them, the people who have been working hard on some of these issues beforehand, challenging the HUD's designation of the housing projects in New Orleans as being unfit for return. Many of our students actually were part, as I said, of a lot of the data collection on this. But the reality is that what happened is that HANO, the Housing Authority of New Orleans, came in and basically condemned housing that was perfectly suitable for resettlement. And the residents, the former residents, have come into federal court. They've managed to get an injunction. They've managed to, more importantly, actually influence federal legislation that I'm not sure what the status is, but Maxine Waters was on the committee that heard the people coming in, and with pictures showing that with minimum kinds of interventions that they could return to their house. So the actual framing of this question in the context of Katrina, or I shouldn't say framing, but the actual emergence of this issue in the context of Katrina, it seems to me provides a moment of possibility of thinking about what might be the rights of poor people in other communities to return, to resist certain forms of redevelopment. It's certainly not the case that one can build an entire legal strategy around it, but it seems to me it's a very important preliminary provisional victory. And what actually happens is still remains to be seen, but it's a very important question. It's challenging the whole question about who gets to sit at the table on the issue of these development questions.
This is a really terrible issue, and I just want to make sure that we have some sense of the magnitude of how terrible that issue is. I mean, what HUD is doing in the public housing context there is turning on its head about 20 years of developed social science rhetoric, if you will, on deconcentrating poverty and on the evils and the failures, many of them negligent, many of them intentional, in the whole construction and the siting of public housing, which is so central to the process of ghettoization in this country and the marginalization primarily of black people, right? So here comes HUD saying this is actually an opportunity to jettison a significant percentage of the extreme poor in New Orleans. And if we get our way, this housing will return in some indefinite time in an 80-20 split, using the language of mixed income, in which case, who will be preferred? That 80% who's middle income. And who will be creamed? That 20% who's allowed to live with them. And where will the remainder of all those people go? There's absolutely no provision. So it's federal policy as calculated limbo in jettisoning and dispersing to wherever very low-income people. On the other hand, or literally on the other side of the bridge, we have the effects of localism. So even if we were to somehow win those of us who care about getting those people back into their homes, into their leases in public housing in New Orleans, which we should remember is among the worst housing you could ever hope to be in this country, right? So even if we could just return the status quo, we would only have reinserted people into a kind of a resource devoid hell because they cannot possibly go into those communities on the other side of the border. And we have examples of that now, right? So the Gretna Bridge incident, where the police stopped evacuees from crossing over, is an example of legal localism that I'm talking about. This is a state-owned bridge, but the Gretna police were allowed to stand there and prevent people from exercising their constitutional rights to come into Gretna to save their lives. Why? Because the police powers allow them to do that. And what has Jefferson Parish done now? Jefferson Parish has just recently passed an ordinance disallowing the construction of multifamily housing in Jefferson Parish through the use of state tax credits made available through CDBG funds by the federal government as part of the recovery effort. Wow. All right? This is localism again. St. Tammany Parish has passed an ordinance allowing, it's just been repealed, but allowing only blood relatives to be able to rent in the homes of homeowners there. So if you're a homeowner in St. Tammany Parish who said, to hell with it, I'm out of here, but I want to rent my home because I got to maintain my mortgage, make sure it's a blood relative. Now, it's 97% white in St. Tammany Parish. So that's a racial ordinance, a la Buchanan v. Worley, right? But it's also localism. It's awkward, it's not going to work, but it's close, and it's done all the time. So the problem is huge in this sense, and how we can talk about these things when it appears that we've got so many mounting on top of each other is critical. But again, I do want to encourage people that, you know, it's not hard to find the localism at the heart of so many of these kinds of things.
Hey, come to the mic. We have probably time for just two more. If you come to the mic, then that'll be it. There's one over here.
It's just very brief. The LA Times just ran a story not too long ago about the African Americans who went to Houston versus the African Americans who resettled in Atlanta. Those African Americans in Atlanta are upwardly mobile. They had resources. They're not coming back. The ones in Houston really want to come back home and resettle in their own homes. And I'm thinking about, again, the framing of sort of dividing African Americans who have resources and who don't. And do you have any, what are your opinions about that? Because it's almost like dividing African Americans who have those resources and those who don't.
I guess I'm the framing guy here. So part of the question that we want to answer then is, what's the nature of the, again, to point back to an earlier panel, and maybe even to Marie's suggestion about acting, what's the goal? So we want us to ask questions of the journalists. What did they have in mind? What did they want the response to the story to be? What did they have in mind with regard to talking about differences within the black population? I raise that way in part even to understand some of the contradictions that flow from, let's call it a liberal or progressive view, all right, that says I'm doing a good thing, I want to help you understand victimization, but inadvertently, all right, construct an understanding of black people and disparity in ways that are ultimately harmful. All right, so I don't know what the reason is, but that's the first kind of question. What would be the intention of the journalist, and what are the consequences that might flow from that frame?
Well, it's almost like New Orleans will be this economic wasteland, and people will not want to come back. If the upwardly mobile African Americans don't want to resettle, then who will be resettling in New Orleans?
Well, it won't be resettlement, as I understand. It will be.
But, you know, this is all at the same time that the housing prices and the rents are skyrocketing. So, I mean, I would be wary of thinking about that the future New Orleans is an economic wasteland. I think that there's a bigger redevelopment picture that just simply doesn't include certain people. So the structural barriers to their return go all the way from sort of how they are ideologically represented all the way down to the kinds of policies that David is talking about.
Okay, let's do this one.
I wanted to just make a quick plug and then a question for David. The plug is not to forget the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, my home state. And to that end, I'm working on a project. Any of you who would be willing to volunteer would love the help on figuring out how to move people from temporary housing, i.e. FEMA trailers, to permanent housing because rental housing isn't available. Slightly different issue as it comes up in Mississippi versus New Orleans. But the question for you is a question that relates to both your advocacy of regionalism, but the acknowledgement that mixed income isn't necessarily going to help poor communities of color. But the politics of regionalism means that people aren't going to buy in with regard to regionalism unless you offer them some integrated, if not assimilationist, approach like the mixed income approach. How do you square that tension?
No, I absolutely agree, and this is one of the great quandaries. I mean, talk about framing. There's this sort of professional framing. You know, you try to look at as many issues as you can, and yet you realize that there are so many other issues that you want to look at, and that you're compelled to look at, but you can't right away. Like so many of the mental health issues that you raise. I mean, these are absolutely critical. I agree with your premise that how can we even think about recovery without recognizing that people are struggling, people are grieving, and people are having difficulty functioning. But I think, Daria, that we have to be careful because while it is absolutely true, and I think consistent with my views on neighborhood transformation, economic development, and empowerment of poor urban communities, to say that they have to be deconcentrated. That is to say, they cannot simply be isolated islands of very poor people with very few resources, with very few social networks, with very few connections to commerce, to good schools, to a sense of stability. They need to share in the resources of more middle-income people, and that there is such a long and tragic story of the sort of disaggregation. That this is the story that William Julius Wilson tells so effectively about the disaggregation of middle-income blacks and others from urban communities into other parts of the city and on into what are now the older inner ring suburbs, leaving behind people who were sort of displaced by industrial transformation and active race discrimination and have become our concentrated ghetto poor, and that it's impossible to imagine those lives being seriously transformed without the presence and the resources of others whose lives are more stable. So I think that as a principle that is absolutely central, and I think it is also consistent with regionalism, because what I'm suggesting by equitable regionalism is that you really just have to have a sharing of those resources. In other words, it has to be possible that black people can live, that poor black people can live in resource-rich suburbs. I mean, the great empirical truth that's almost never discussed is that this is what happens to white people. I mean, the white poor in this country is what we really ought to be talking about in terms of poverty. Their numbers outstrip other poverty by a whole lot. But the one distinguishing feature of white poverty is that it is not isolated and it is not concentrated. And it is also not as sustained. So therein lies some evidence that people who live in communities where there's more civic activism, where there's more political responsiveness among political representatives, schools are better, roads are better, infrastructure is maintained, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's more opportunity for wealth acquisition, there's more opportunity for a whole bunch of other things that economically stabilize lives. That said, the problem is, as we've seen in so much housing litigation, you can't just wipe the slate clean. You can't just jettison people. I mean, it's the problem. There's litigation in Newark, for instance, in terms of imploding these terrible high-rises, where they had to do it. These were death traps in so many ways after the riots in the 60s in Newark. But the problem was there was supposed to be one-for-one relocation housing built, and it wasn't built. And you just simply cannot maintain the policy without recognizing the need for where people are going to go. There's your opportunity, and instead of that, and Professor Cheryl is here, and he knows much more about this than I do. You really need to match those two policies, and we haven't. And the fact that we haven't, I think, is very telling about excuse me, our commitment to poor people in this country, especially black poor.
Last question or comment?
Just a short comment in terms of what
Professor
Trout said. Trout mentioned that in terms of being racial neutrality and also in terms of structural racism. What I see happening in terms of in New Orleans is what's currently happening in South Africa, using space as a identity marker or as a cultural marker, because I cannot use race because race has been outlawed. So now I use space. And if that space cannot be sanctioned, what I do is, I think Professor Harris just mentioned that now, I raise the bar so that the ordinary black folk cannot attain to be at that particular space that has been identified as being white. That's why I just need to make that comment.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for being at this panel. I want to give our panelists a hand.